My sermon title, as a matter of fact, is from a song, Ordinary Love, not the Sade version. No, this is U2. U2. I believe U2 has something to do with that first song, MLK. See, Bono has it. Bono knows what's going on. Now, U2 wrote Ordinary Love as part of the soundtrack to the film Mandela, Long Walk to Freedom. And as some of you all may have read in my synopsis of this sermon, I was privileged and pleased to be in attendance listening to the film with the help of narration. That narration will tell me what's going on, and then the dialogue kicks in, and I'm right there. So it was a wonderful, delightful event that stirred my heart. And at the end, as the narrator said, Mandela's face has the sun in the back, and so you can see his face in the sun. It's glowing behind him. And I was sitting there picturing this, and then the credits began to roll, and the narrator read every word of the credits. Now, that's usually the time we get up and walk out. But I was pleased to hear the names of those people. And over that, the narrator was speaking in a quiet voice because U2 was playing Ordinary Love. Ordinary Love. And the refrain to Ordinary Love is, we can't fall further if we don't feel ordinary love. We can't reach higher if we don't deal with ordinary love. Now, those are heavy lyrics, I'm telling you. We can't fall any further if we don't feel ordinary love. I know you didn't ask me to sing, but it's a nice beat. Well, that's to Mandela. But as I sat there listening, I said, that's what King was all about. King was getting us to reach a little further. But he was using this thing about love. And love is so much more than just smiling and nodding to people and saying, I love you. No, it's so much more than that. You can't fall any further if you don't feel ordinary love. That's bottom line. You have to understand that you are part of the human family. So I said, this is King. This is what I want to get to people when we're talking about honoring Dr. King. I want people to understand how deep this man was. We have sanitized revisionist history and made Dr. King just a cardboard character. And that's sad. And we talk about Dr. King, about the dream, as if that's it. But Dr. King was so much, much more, and I'm going to give you some of it this morning. We first start with the fact that you have to put yourself in the context of Dr. King. Put yourself back there. Let's talk about the climate of these United States of America. In the time when Dr. King was leading and directing the assault on ingrained racism. If you think back on those days, those heady days, we talked about the March on Washington in 1963 and how, as we look at it now, we say, oh, it was just a march, but how important that was. How the whole country changed their perspective on what was going on in the South, because it wasn't just the South. It was the United States of America. It was all over. And people were gathering from all places. And besides black folks, you had white folks as well. So all the fear that had managed to amount to a whole bunch of nothingness kind of went away. All the troops who were on standby to go in there and rescue the women and children, they didn't need to do that. That was 1963. So from 63, we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Our president, John F. Kennedy, had a civil rights bill that didn't have very much in it, but he was still pushing it. His assassination and the resulting vice president, Lyndon Johnson, becoming president, and he said, we're going to pass a civil rights bill, and he put a whole lot into it. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed. Then the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed. Thurgood Marshall became a Supreme Court justice, the first African American on the Supreme Court. Those were the times we were breaking through. There was a war on poverty. But then something happened, church. The momentum began to lag. People began to think less about civil rights because their mind was on Vietnam. Vietnam took over. The war on poverty was defunded by the war on Vietnam. We find then that in the 60s, people began to respond in the cities to this kind of backslap. And you find there were racial conflicts, sometimes called riots. Other people call them rebellions in Detroit and Rochester and Spanish Harlem and even New Britain, Connecticut, Birmingham, Alabama. There were riots before the death of Dr. King. So revisionist history doesn't tell you that, but that's true. In Watts, 6 days of rioting occurred in Los Angeles that resulted in 34 people dead, over 1,000 injured, 175 million in fire damage, 4,000 arrested. That was in Watts in 1965. So we began to see in this deluge of conflagration, that's what it was, a conflagration, just fire, incendiary fire in all these cities. All of these things were going on. And then in 1968, Dr. King was assassinated. Dr. King was cut down from the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. In 1968, I was in my senior year in high school. And on the evening of April 4th, I was returning to my home after a band rehearsal. And I had my radio on, and the radio was telling me that Dr. King was dead. I got home, I walked in, and my parents were glued to the television set. I sat down with them in silence, and our grief just hung over us like a pall. Suddenly the telephone rang, and it just shocked me. There was something other than the voice of the commentator talking. So I got up and I answered the phone. An unknown Caucasian voice said to me, "Gerald, do you know they caught Dr. King's killer?" I was surprised. And I said, "No, I didn't know that, because we had been watching. No, I didn't know they caught. Who is this?" And the person said, "Do you know what they charged him with?" And I said, "Murder." And the voice said, "Shooting coon out of season." And he hung up the phone. And that click was like a gunshot to my head. I came back and I told my parents, and my dad said, "Jerry, that's someone who you go to school with every day. That person probably smiles at you, sits next to you. But that person doesn't have your welfare in mind. So this is a lesson for you to learn. Smiling faces tell lies. Sometimes they don't tell the truth." So I learned that lesson from my dad for a minute, because I'm that kind of kid that I said, "Well, let me see. And so I made friends anyway. I stepped outside my little boundary and I talked openly about how I felt. But that's my story. Let's go back to Dr. King. Dr. King was assassinated in '68. But I want you all to hear something very important that's not talked about. 1 year to the date of his death, April 4, 1967, Dr. King was speaking at Riverside Church, invited by the clergy and laity concerned about Vietnam. He was asked to make an address to the clergy and laity concerned about Vietnam. Sometimes when you have the time, go to YouTube, type in Riverside Address, Dr. King, 1967. Sit down and listen. It'll take a while because this was a speech more than a sermon. Dr. King spoke for the first time in this very large public venue about his concern about the war in Vietnam. Many people won't tell you this, but that's when J. Edgar Hoover said, "This is the most dangerous man in America," after this speech. Dr. King spoke eloquently about why racial justice must be global justice. And I want you to hear just a little bit of the words Dr. King said that evening. I'm going to ask Reverend Marlon Lavenhar to come forward and read just a little bit, excerpt from that speech, April 4, 1967.
Dr. Martin Luther King said, "The words of the late John F. Kennedy come back to haunt us. 5 years ago, he said, 'Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable.'" And at this point, please understand, there was sustained applause. Thousands of clergy and others in New York City listening to this speech heard those words and applauded for a long time, and you'll hear that on the YouTube video. As soon as he said, "Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable." Increasingly by choice or by accident, this is the role our nation has taken, the role of those who make peaceful revolution impossible by refusing to give up the privileges and the pleasures that come from the immense profits of overseas investments. I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered.
Thank you, brother. Do you see what J. Edgar Hoover heard? He said, "Oh no, this man now is moving beyond the little black folks trying to get their freedom and appealing to the moral consciousness of good white folks. Now he's saying the United States is the problem. And not only is it around racism, but it's around the fact that we have an attitude that we have to consume everything at the expense of people. And then we go out and we're such bullies on the world stage, our militarism takes over, feeding this whole complex. So Dr. King became dangerous to everyone. That was 1 year to the day before his death. So that's what the climate is. That's what's going on, and I want to speak a little bit about what's going on right now, lest we feel those are ancient days. Church, whenever we start talking about consequences of our government's system and structures, we become dangerous. We're supposed to be comfortable. We're supposed to go out and buy. That's the American way. But when you start caring about everyone and dealing with ordinary love with everyone, then you become dangerous. But it's okay. It's okay, because this is the preacher part of me coming out now. We are called to be dangerous, church, if you realize fully that our capacity is not made by us, but our capacity is given to us through spiritual means. That means that we can learn, we can earn, we can give, we can receive. Our cups are full and runneth over. We don't have to be just quiet and just nice. Dr. King was calling upon all that is inside of us to have that kind of feeling. Now, let me bring it home to what's going on right now. We have huge issues right now. Income inequality, to name one. Medical inequality, to name another. Those are the kinds of issues that people say, well, they're going to always be here. My favorite conservative columnist, David Brooks. You all know I like David Brooks. But David Brooks wrote a column the other day where he said, we're confusing cause and effect. He said, that's effect, the income inequality. He said, the causes are different, and we need to use our resources wisely. And then he started talking about the causes, and he sounded to me like he was blaming people. The fact of high unemployment among young African Americans. Well, you have to look at young African Americans for that. Yes, they have bad schools, but, those are the communities they live in. And I was very disappointed in my favorite conservative columnist, but then again, that's why he's conservative, so I understand. But I still will read David Brooks because he likes you too as well. But the point, church, is that these causes have to do with structure. They have to do with systems. And those systems have to do with where our money goes. So there is a very good book called What Money Cannot Buy. It was part of All Souls Reads last month. You're missing something, church, if you're not coming to that on the second Sunday each month. But Michael Sandel, a philosopher from Harvard, wrote this book, What Money Can't Buy. And he said the problem is we have a market economy, but we are becoming a market society. We look at everything in terms of market price. And some things are non-market values. You heard Dr. King talking about a revolution of values. Well, that revolution of values he's talking about, now we have price tags on them. It is our responsibility as citizens to incarcerate people if they don't follow the rules. But who's going to prison? Mass incarceration is the effect. It wipes out half of the African American community. I exaggerate when I say half, but a significant portion. Going to prison over what? Non-violent property crimes. But the bottom line is, once you have a record, you don't get a job. You don't get to work. It's a lot of things you don't get, and that's why Michelle Alexander wrote The New Jim Crow. It's the same thing going on. That's a system problem. That's not the fault of the victim, but we have to analyze it from that. That means you're going to be dangerous. You start analyzing. But that's okay, church. That's what we're called to do. So the effects of mass incarceration, income inequality, medical health issues that are skewed and messed up and too expensive, and paying doctor bills and medication that's too much to pay, all of that has to do with looking how we look at things. A market society, it's got a price on it. You got to pay it. If you got it, pay it. If you don't, well, you're the poor. Our thinking has warped. The revolution of values has been skewed. So what do? This is what I want us to do. When we think of Dr. King as a dangerous man. Think of Dr. King as your brother. A dangerous man who is your brother, who is telling you, this is the price you have to pay. It's okay, but you must pay it. Others have paid it before you. But this is what you must do. You cannot maintain the good if you are comfortably situated. What did Frosty Troy used to say? Afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. Well, if we're comfortable, we need to be afflicted. Dr. King is our afflicting brother who is calling us today, saying to us, be dangerous. It's okay. You have to do this. You have to rise up. So I'm taking some things from Dr. King. On this day when we are about to have a celebration of his birth, which will be a day of service, try to do some service tomorrow. Some kind of way, do that. But I'm taking some things from Dr. King, and I'm starting with the fact, when I grew up, television was just getting started. And there was a lady that used to come on, and she talked about the do-bees and the don't-bees. Some of you all are old enough, you all know what I'm talking about. What's her name, Miss Francis? Something like that. But she talked about do-bees and don't-bees. Don't be whatever, and do be this. Well, I got some do-bees for you that came from Dr. King, from my study of Dr. King. It's only 4. Do be strategic. Now, some people say, have a plan. Some folks say, have a plan, plan to work and work the plan. Whatever, I say be strategic. Dr. King he wrote this in a letter to the Birmingham jail when the religious moderates had chastised him for a demonstration that landed him and others in the jail in Birmingham. And so they were saying, you're just agitating. You're coming in there doing that. And these are his colleagues, right? And they're writing him. So he wrote the letter to the Birmingham jail. It's a long letter, but it's actually not. But he says it's the longest letter he ever wrote. He says, but then when you're in jail, what can you do except write long letters, think long thoughts, and say long prayers? So he wrote the letter to the Birmingham jail that won't take you a long time to read it, but I urge you to do that. It's free. It's online. He says that everyone who was part of his movement did 4 things. They started out by gathering facts. They found out what was going on in that place. That's strategy. You have to know what's going on, gathering facts. He said the second thing we then tried to negotiate. We tried to negotiate to find out if something was wrong, how can we get it corrected? The third thing they did, church, they did self-purification. And what that meant was that they got everybody together and said, you need to know what's about to happen to you. Some people will curse you, spit on you, hit you, kick you, arrest you, jail you, all of these horrible things. But you have to be ready for that. And so they did these workshops that were aimed around getting people centered, getting people grounded, because this was nonviolence. I say self-purification is good even when we're not demonstrating. You have to go in somewhere to that prayer closet of yours, and you have to go ahead and empty yourself, church. It's okay. And some people say, I don't know what to say. I don't know if there is a God. I don't know what. Just start talking. Start talking. Start saying, I don't know what I'm doing here. But such and such and such and such and such and such and such. And before you know it, you're praying. You're speaking about gratitude and you're speaking about what you need. The last thing Dr. King said in that strategy is direct action. And he said direct action is done in order to go back to negotiation. We say to people, if you don't hear what we're saying, we're going to cause such a crisis that the national spotlight will be on you and everyone will be looking at you as to why can't you just use ordinary love? So he says then that's the whole point of direct action is to get back to negotiation. So do be strategic. I also say, do be inclusive. You don't know who your allies are until you start asking and working. You don't rule people out. Be inclusive. Look beyond just the familiar. Talk to people about their stories. Before you know it, you may have an ally, someone who sees themselves in you. And that's the whole point. We're in this together. Human action, global rights. So do be inclusive. Do be generous. Generous in your sense that you're not having everything. You don't need to hold it in. But you allow your generosity to show where your heart is. Those are some of the things that I take away from Dr. King. But the most important one, do be love. Be love, church. Because ordinary love is at the center of everything Dr. King did. He used ordinary love to reach beyond whatever he thought he could do. Dr. King, the son of a minister, the grandson of a minister, the great, all of his father was a minister, his grandfather was a minister, his great-grandfather was a minister. Dr. King grew up knowing that in a middle-class life, knowing that he was going to be somebody. He went to schools that most people couldn't get a chance to go to. He graduated, came back so that he would start his ministry and be a credit to his people. And suddenly, love hit him in the face. Love hit him in the face because he looked at his people, his members who were hurting. And he said, I love these people. I can't allow this to happen. He put himself out there to help, all on love, church. That's what Dr. King represents for me. He was strategic. He was inclusive. He was generous. But he was also love. On this day that we prepare ourselves for a day of service, I ask that you take this with you. Love is the answer. Amen.